Okay. Okay, guys. So just before we proceed, we just recap of what we have studied. So we started with different types of arguments for protectionism. From there, we went on to look at 6 types of non-tariff barriers. The first one was specific limitations on trade. The second was customs and administrative entry procedures. The third was standards. The fourth was government participation in trade. And the fifth was charges on imports. And the sixth was other mechanisms. So from there, we went on to look at monetary barriers. There are 3 monetary barriers basically we looked at: blocked currency, differential exchange rate, and government approvals. So from there, we are looking at tariffs. So we said there are specific tariffs and ad valorem. And we looked at some very good case studies of Florida versus Brazilian orange juice companies. Okay, how tariffs play an important role. From there, we looked at different types of subsidies. Subsidies can be tax breaks, cash grants, government equity participation, or low interest loans. From there, we looked at agricultural subsidies and the banana wars. The case study on banana wars was very interesting. We went through it very carefully. From there, we looked at European Union sugar subsidies and how European Union has actually violated the WTO rules, guidelines when it comes to giving sugar subsidies to its own farmers. Then we looked at cotton subsidies by United States and what is its impact on Mali. We have looked at this particular case study. And finally, the last slide we saw before the break was on import quotas versus voluntary export restraints. And we have seen the difference and the advantages of both these mechanisms. Okay, now we move on from there to multi-fiber agreements. So let's understand what's a multi-fiber agreement. So it's nothing but setting a quota limiting the amount of imports of textiles and clothing from developing to developed countries, okay, from Asia to Europe, from let's say China to US, from India to US. That's called a multi-fiber agreement, especially for textile products, okay. And it was phased out by 2005. Okay, and obviously once this multi-fiber agreement finishes in 2005, that's where actually there will not be any quota. You can export as much as you require. Okay, so from multi-fiber agreement, we also looked at dumping and anti-dumping policy. I think this is something that we have been closely watching. I have given you a few articles on dumping in the last, I've posted in the WhatsApp group. So I hope you can understand. Let's look at the concept first, then we look at the cases. Okay, dumping. What is dumping? Selling goods into a foreign market below the production cost or selling below fair market value. For example, in China, your production of, let's say, tire, okay, production of tire, the cost is, let's say, $5 or $10, okay, $5 per tire. But if you're selling below $5, then we call it as dumping. Now, how can you dump? How you can sell below the cost of production? That's a question. This can only be done by subsidies by government. If government is giving subsidies to the manufacturer, then manufacturer is able to sell the product at a very nominal price in order to beat the competition. Then it will be charged as dumping. Now, in order to counter dumping policies, there is anti-dumping policy. Now, anti-dumping policies are there to punish foreign companies and protect local industry from unfair trade practices. So in dumping, what you do, you sell below the cost of production. In anti-dumping, the government comes out with policies which will stop governments to dump. So let's look at a few articles, okay, that I'll share with you the link also. Just give me a few seconds, please. Okay. Let's look at this particular case study on China versus Australia, okay, on dumping charges. So China challenges Australia anti-dumping measures at WTO. So there's a war going on between China and Australia. Can you see this screen, please?
Yes, can see.
Is this, I mean, you can read, let us begin off.
Yeah, can see. China and Australia's dumping
Yes.
trade war.
Yes. Yeah. So the China filed a lawsuit at the World Trade Organization, WTO, challenging Australia's anti-dumping measures on a range of goods, marking further escalation in tensions between the two countries. Now, the case is this, regarding Chinese export of train wheels, wind turbines, and stainless steel sinks. China is exporting train wheels, wind turbines, and stainless steel sinks to Australia. Now, Australia challenged Beijing's crippling tariff on Australia wine export. Now, you know, there is a trade friction going on between Australia and China since many months. So the first was Australia wine export. The China challenged or stopped the wine export, saying, you know, they're dumping wine into China at a very low price. So in retaliation, Australia challenged China, saying, you know, they are dumping steel products into Australia. So it's a tit for tat situation. Now, why the Chinese Commerce Ministry said that they want to safeguard the legitimate rights and interests of Chinese companies. We hope that Australia will take concrete actions to correct its wrong practices, avoid distortions in the trade of related products, and bring such trade back to normal track as soon as possible. Australia imposed tariff on Chinese-built train wheels and wind turbines since 2019. So they put import tariff, okay, customs tariff from 2019. China in November announced tariff of up to 218% on Australian wines, which it said were being dumped into the Chinese market at subsidized price. Now, I hope you can understand the situation here. Okay, so both countries are accusing each other of dumping. So Australia is accusing China of dumping steel products in Australia. China is accusing Australia of dumping wine, Australian wine in China. That's the situation. So the crackdown virtually closed what had been Australia's biggest overseas wine market, with sales falling from Australian 1.1 billion to just 20 million. So they have a loss of $90 billion US dollars because China stopped importing Australian wine. So what happened? Prime Minister Scott Morrison warned that his government would respond forcefully to countries trying to economic coercion against. So that's why Australia used another dumping mechanism against China by imposing taxes on China steel. Okay. So exports of which China had been worth around 1 billion a year. Beijing imposed tough economic sanctions on a range of Australian products, ranging from high tariffs to disruptive practices across several agricultural sectors, coal, wine, and tourism. So a lot of areas, even education, a lot of Chinese students used to study in Australia. So now because of all these, the number of Chinese students going to Australia has also come down. China opposes, so this is from the foreign minister, China opposes the abuse of trade remedy measures, which not only damages legitimate rights and interests of Chinese companies, but also hurts solemnness and authority of WTO rules. So both countries are accusing one another here. Okay. So this tit for tat measure, it's widely seen in Canberra. Canberra is the capital of Australia as punishment for pushing back against Beijing's operations to impose influence in Australia, rejecting Chinese investment in sensitive areas and publicly calling for an investigation into the origin of the coronavirus pandemic. So if you remember, the whole problem started with this issue of coronavirus pandemic. So Australia publicly called for an investigation into the origin of coronavirus pandemic, saying it has originated from Wuhan lab and so on. And then in retaliation, the China imposed tariffs on Australian wine, and in retaliation, Australia imposed tariffs on steel goods and so on. So it is a kind of tit for tat situation. Okay. So this, sorry. Wow, that is a bike racing along. Okay. So I hope you understand this particular case study, how important this case study is for us to understand, there are similar case studies, we had a case study between, dumping case against India versus China, which I discussed in the last class with other section of students. But you can read that also. This was a case against, India saying that China is dumping cheap rubber or especially tires into Indian market from China. So, and that was hurting the sentiments of the Indian tire manufacturers. So quite interesting case studies. Let's go back. I hope that was an interesting case study for you to understand what dumping is all about. Now let's move on. Or let's look at the next case study. Japan versus South Korea. That's another interesting case study that we can look at. I'm posting the link here for you. Okay. So this is another case study that we need to look at, where China launches new anti-dumping probe into steel products from Japan, South Korea, European Union. So another interesting case for us to look at. So let's go through this case. China launched an anti-dumping investigation into grain-oriented flat-rolled electrical steel imported from Japan, South Korea, and European Union following an expiry of tariffs in place for the last 5 years. So there's another case on steel products. So this time China is filing a case against Japan, South Korea, and European Union. Those tariffs will, however, be reinstated during the investigation, which is due to be completed this year. The probe comes after China Iron and Steel and Unit of Beijing petitioned the ministry in May, arguing that the end to the tariff could lead to further dumping and hurt the domestic steel sector. So in fact, the Chinese steel manufacturer, China Baoshan Iron and Steel Company, they filed a case with Chinese government first, saying if you stop the dumping duty, then it is going to hurt the domestic steel sector. Japanese steelmakers, including JFE Steel Corporation, Nippon Steel, and Sumitomo Metal, will pay anti-dumping duty rates ranging from 39 to 45.7% to China if they want to export steel to China. European Union tariffs are 46 point, while for those for Korean companies are 37.3%. Okay. Anti-dumping measures against electrical steel from the United Kingdom have been dropped completely. So you find that all these cases are going on in WTO. Okay, they keep filing cases against one another. This is a very common news, and if you search online, there'll be hundreds of similar cases, that you can find on dumping and anti-dumping. Okay, let's move on. The next case that we have is United States versus Vietnam catfish dispute. Even you see, even the fish market has a problem. So we need to study the catfish dispute. Let's look at the catfish dispute. I'll send the link here for you to look at. Okay, guys, I think you can have a look at this particular web page. Can you see this? The catfish war. It's an interesting case study between US and Vietnam. Now, Alabama, US, employs roughly 3,000 people working with farmed catfish. The domestic industry has been cut in about half over the past 15 years, primarily due to competition from Vietnam. So you see, the Vietnam catfish are very cheap when compared to the American catfish. So let's listen to what the catfish farmer in Alabama has to say. His name is Kaiser, okay, Townsend Kaiser. He says, I don't know how it got to the destination, but we are proud to have a catfish industry as well as in this area of Alabama. It is one of the biggest economic drivers in Alabama. It creates a lot of job in Alabama. Alabama's catfish industry employs roughly 3,000 people and captured $115 million in sales. That is in 2018, okay? The part of the state around Greensboro has been right soil and climate to build catfish ponds. Since the US and Vietnam signed a bilateral trade agreement in 2001, it's been a struggle for southern catfish farmers, most of whom are concentrated in Alabama and Mississippi. Now, Kaiser, who is also president of the Catfish Farmers Association, says the domestic catfish industry has been cut in half over the past 15 years. Now, what happened? We need to understand. The southern catfish farmers have tried several tactics to slow imports from Vietnam. First, they said, this catfish from Vietnam, it's not even catfish. Okay. People were calling it catfish. A lot of people were confused by that. Vietnamese farmers weren't confused. They said they were raising catfish just as Asian species. Still, US federal law was changed so Asian imports could not be labeled as catfish. And yet, frozen Vietnamese, don't call them catfish, kept coming into US. So the southern catfish farmers said the government subsidized Vietnamese fish imports were violating trade rules. Now, they are accusing Vietnamese farmers, okay, saying it is subsidized catfish. That's why they're able to sell it very low. Okay, so this is a catfish farmer. So the catfish farmers of America adopted another strategy, tout the health of domestically raised product, especially compared with the Asian imports. I would not eat it. It's grown in the Mekong River Delta, which is one of the most polluted water system in the world. So a lot of campaigns they tried to stop the import of Vietnamese catfish to America. So they said, you know, these catfish are raised in the most polluted river. Don't eat. You are not going to drop dead, but there could be some concerns about long-term exposure to some of the things that they are using. Okay. So they kept on fighting, but somehow their business did not pick up because the Vietnamese catfish were very cheap and people preferred low-priced catfish to expensive catfish from Alabama. Okay, so this is another interesting case. You can read this. You can read this, okay? So the Vietnamese government did not respond to any of the stories, okay? So please read, go through this story. It's a very interesting case study. Even, you know, simple things, how it can lead to a war between countries, you know. It's exactly what is a trade war happening because of the discounts or the catfish dispute that's happening between these two countries. Okay, let's move on. I hope you understood the catfish story. Maybe you can start eating your own catfish, maybe the China catfish. Catfish is quite tasty, a lot of flesh, right? Do you have catfish in China?
Maybe.
You have. Do you eat catfish?
No.
You don't eat catfish.
The fish
Because-
is not good.
Not good.
Yeah.
Oh, but in Malaysia, you find a lot of catfish being sold. You know, this is one of the preferred fish in Malaysia. They eat catfish. So when you come to Malaysia, I will take you to the wet market. I'll show you catfish.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's good.
So you see, interesting trade wars taking place even on catfish. Okay, let's move on from there. So all these were, you know, the restrictions. We are looking at protectionism, you know. All these policies were to protect local market. Now we move on to the second part of the story. Okay, sorry. The second part of the story, that is economic sanctions. Now, economic sanctions are quite common nowadays among countries. A lot of economic sanctions are taking place. You can have economic sanctions on countries, on organizations, or on individuals, all these categories. So economic sanctions are laws that restrict or prohibit dealing with countries, companies, or individuals. So once sanctions are imposed, you cannot, for example, sanctions were imposed on Iran. So no countries were able to trade with Iran, especially buying oil, like India. India stopped buying oil from Iran. Similarly, many countries could not, buy oil from Iran. Now, there are a lot of Iranians in Malaysia. They couldn't open a bank account in Malaysia. Their bank accounts were closed because of the economic sanctions, because US and Malaysia has quite good friendly ties. You understand? Obviously, China did not abide by these sanctions. They kept on buying oil from Iran. So many countries and international organizations impose economic sanctions. So international organizations can be United Nations, countries, United States, or European Unions. Normally, only the most rich and powerful countries can go for an economic sanctions. Otherwise, nobody cares about your sanctions. Okay, if America sanctions, definitely it becomes a sanction. So economic sanctions target terrorism, or those promoting terrorism, or narcotics, drugs dealers, or government officials suppressing democracy in their home country, the spread of weapons of mass destruction. Iran and Iraq, if you remember, Iraq was also under, this kind of sanctions. Cuba is under sanctions. So what are the UN sanctions? Let's look at the UN sanctions. The United Nations sanctions mainly is meant for against countries or groups or individuals who fail to preserve peace, okay, or against nuclear proliferation or terrorism, So these are the areas where United Nations impose economic sanctions. So the UN sanctions include sanctions on Iran, Somalia, North Korea, Al-Qaeda, and so on. So once UN sanctions are imposed, this must be followed by respective countries. That's very important. Other countries must follow. So many countries, including United States, European Union, Switzerland, they implement the United Nations sanctions very quickly. Okay, so the moment UN gives a sanction, then these countries follow. But some countries may not follow it. That's a different story. Now, the second is US economic sanctions. I mean, this is more serious than the United Nations sanctions. If you look at the list of sanctions, the US has had more economic sanctions than the United Nations, okay? So this is a country-based sanction or list-based sanctions. Country-based sanctions restrict or prohibit transactions involving goods, services, companies, or individuals. They want to have sanctions on Iran, so they can have sanctions on people like generals, businessmen, or companies. Okay, if you remember the recent sanction on a China company by the United States, all of you are aware of, right? The company's name. Then the country-based sanctions restrict or prohibit transactions involving goods, services, companies, or individuals of certain countries. So we have good examples here, like United States have sanctioned Cuba, Iran, Syria, North Korea, and so on and on, Russia. Okay, so there has been many sanctions. Sanctions can be a blanket sanction or a limited sanction. Limited sanctions could be on certain products, services, or people. A blanket sanction means any person from that country, any company from that country cannot deal with another country. Okay, we also had Myanmar, Sudan. I hope, even Vietnam, all those cases, I'm sure you're quite familiar with. Then we have the list-based sanctions. This is mainly on individuals, companies, and other organizations. We also have a sanction called prohibition, where specifically designated nationals, SDNs. These SDNs can be individual, company, or associations, which can be an NGO, a charity, or even ships. Ships can also be under sanctions. So examples of this specially designated nationals can be like Osama bin Laden, then Hezbollah, etc., etc. So many cases we had here. Okay. So all these persons and organizations on the list of sanctions by UN, European Union, and number of countries, if you see. So trading with these organizations, dealing with these countries or individuals are strictly prohibited. Cuba, Iran, 2 countries. So what are the sanctions involved? Governments, companies incorporated in these countries, persons physically located in these countries, whatever may be their citizenship. So if they are in that country, sanctions apply to them also. Cuban nationals wherever located. So if Cubans are, let's say, in Malaysia, so the sanctions are applicable to them. That's why I told you Iranians in Malaysia were under sanctions, so they couldn't open the bank account in Malaysia. They have limited freedom, movement of freedom, here. So from these countries, there is no import to United States. At the same time, there is no purchase from these countries. So there's no transportation, no insurance, nothing should be there. So it's a blanket ban basically on all kinds of trade, movement of goods, people, service from that particular country. There is no financial transactions. That means you cannot send money to Iran or to Cuba from any country. Especially, for example, from Malaysia, you cannot send. Legally, you cannot send money from here to Iran because that is banned. So any kind of transaction shouldn't be there. Syria, another example. United States prohibit exports of US goods or service to Syria without a license. That means you need to have a special license if you want to send goods to Syria. So exception to this is maybe some of the agricultural products and medicine based on humanitarian grounds, okay? Now, Syria's largest bank has been identified as the prime center of money laundering. So there is no monetary transaction with Syria also. There is no import from Syria to United States also. Especially we are looking at petroleum products. It cannot be imported from Syria to US. There can be other products that can be imported. North Korea, classical example. You are all familiar with the animosity between North Korea and the US. So if you want to export to North Korea, it requires a special license. But there are certain products like food on humanitarian grounds, okay? Food can be sent, but it's very difficult. The process is very lengthy. The paperwork is too cumbersome. So normally nobody would try to do that. Same way, any import from North Korea must be authorized by the US government. So it's interesting also to look at the list. Okay, maybe you should actually look at this list. It's something interesting. Let's look at the list of. This is the US Department of Treasury website. So this website, this is the official website of the United States, okay? This particular website tells you which are the countries under sanction. You can see the list, okay? What are the different types of sanction programs, like the Balkan related sanctions, Belarus sanctions in 2011, Burma related sanctions, Burundi sanctions, Central African Republic sanctions, Chinese military company sanction, then narcotics trafficking sanctions, counter-terrorism sanctions, Cuba sanctions, the one we studied just now, cyber-related sanctions, and so on. So maybe you want to look at your own country. What happened? China military company sanctions. So they have given all the guidelines related to the sanctions here. So you can go through the requirements, what are the requirements and so on. Okay. So addressing threat from securities investments that finance certain companies of the People's Republic of China and so on and on. Okay. So this way, this one example I just wanted to show you. If you look at, there are hundreds of sanctions by United States, you know, like Hong Kong related sanction. This is a recent sanction because of the unrest that is happening in Hong Kong. So they have put out the guidelines here, what kind of sanctions and who are affected and so on. Okay. Same way, we also have Iran, okay, Iran sanctions, Iraq sanctions, Lebanon sanctions, Libya sanctions, Mali sanctions, North Korean sanctions, Russian sanctions, Somali sanctions, Sudan sanctions. So there are, you know, this year alone, if you look at, you know, the 2021 sanctions list, it's such a huge list of sanctions. So you can go through this. It's very interesting to study and see what is the rationale for US to impose sanctions on all these countries or governments or companies or individuals. Okay, so you can take time to go through this. It's quite interesting to look at it. Okay. So let's move on from there. So what are the exceptions to sanctions? Like information materials like books, music, movies, etc. There is no sanction from whichever country. Travel, there isn't. Recently, they had introduced travel ban on Iran nationals. I remember that. Okay, and even certain individuals from China, they couldn't travel to US. There was a travel ban, if you remember. The personal remittance to family members, there is no ban on that. Humanitarian relief, like giving aids, helping people, food, etc. There is no restriction on that. Okay. So there are certain, you know, exceptions to sanctions also. Now, sanctions against individuals, you know, like specially designated nationals. Like the best example is Osama bin Laden. Okay. Then there was sanction against the Iraq president if you remember, Saddam Hussein. So most of the SDNs include terrorists, drug traffickers, those trafficking in weapons of mass destruction, WMD, weapons of mass destruction. Then government officials of countries suppressing democracy like Belarus, Zimbabwe. Now even there is a huge hue and cry, say there must be sanction on which country is that? It's not, which country, I just forgot the name of that country. Okay, it's not Thailand, it's not Vietnam, but which is the country? Yeah, can't remember. Okay, so what happened when SDN is imposed? Very limited opportunity for transactions. That means practically it is zero. You can't, those individuals cannot do transactions with other countries. Then that means there's a freeze on their assets, property. It could be monetary, physical assets, and so on. Okay, then these are the things that must be done, like blocking the property, informing US government within 10 days, and maintaining control over the property until the government tells them what to do with it, especially if they are in US. Okay. Then you have the European Union sanctions. European unions do not have as many sanctions as the US has. They also have a list of restricted persons with whom European Union citizens and companies cannot do business. So what do they need to do? They must freeze the funds of other property belonging to the restricted persons if they come in possession of them. So mostly to do with countries like Iran, North Korea, Russia, and so on. Recently there was a sanction on Russia because of Russian invasion of Crimea, if you remember, a few years back. So I think that's the end of the story from my side today. I hope you gained something out of this particular lecture. So basically, we are looking at sanctions and protectionism as a tool by countries, and we have seen numerous cases and examples how countries employ these kind of tools. Okay, do you have questions? Do you have any questions on sanctions and protectionism? Hello? Hello, class. Any questions? Okay, so if you say no questions, any questions on your assignment? Any doubts? Anything you want to ask me? Anything?
Yeah, I think that sanctions and protectionism are a bad way to hurt the economy.
Pardon?
Yeah,
Can you be a bit louder?
sanctions and protectionism are a bad way to hurt the economy, and it prevents
Yes.
the trade to communicate healthy.
You're absolutely right. It's
Yeah,
really hard on economy.
Yes.
Because the moment sanctions are imposed, the common people suffer a lot. Now you look at Iranian, the inflation is 3,000 times higher. People, you know, they work 1 month, their 1 month's wage is equivalent to Malaysian ringgit, 60 ringgit, you know, 1 month's wage because of the inflation. So that's why a lot of people are leaving Iran. They are moving to other countries, especially other Muslim countries, friendly Muslim countries like Malaysia. So you can imagine the hardship people are having in Iran, you know. If they want to buy one pair of jeans, their 1 month's salary is not enough because it's equivalent to 60 ringgit. In 60 ringgit, you cannot buy a pair of jeans, you know. It's very difficult. I have a lot of friends from Iran working in Malaysia. So I know the story very well, the hardships that they're facing there in their country. But Iran is a wonderful country. The people are so friendly. If you go there, people are very friendly. It's not a hardcore Muslim country per se. People very friendly. The food is very nice. And the weather is very good. And the products are very cheap and so on, you know. But now, because of the economic sanctions, everyone is suffering, irrespective, rich and poor. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
Good.
I heard that the Iran, the people from Iran are very friendly and kind.
Okay. Yeah. Anybody, any thoughts on today's class? Did you guys understand the idea? Yeah. Meow. Any questions? Yin, any question? Yifei, any question? Bolin, any question? Simin? Chujun?
No question. No question.
Okay. If no questions,
question.
time to
Thank
say
you.
goodbye.
Okay. Have a good weekend.
Thank you. Wish you the same. Stay safe, all of you. Take care.
Yeah.
Bye-bye. See you next
Thank
week.
you.
See you next.
Next week is week 9. Huh? Don't forget assignment submission.
Okay. Submission.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Thank you.
Professor.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Professor.
Bye.
Bye.